Hi, my name's Fiona. My project looks at the English colonisation of the Celts in Ireland. I actually grew up in Scotland, and sharing a similar culture, the research in Ireland has been something close to my heart. I actually didn't know much about any of this until doing this project, so it's been very interesting. I want to begin with a brief history of Ireland, going back to before the Celts even arrived. I think it's important to mention to get the full picture. Throughout the Stone and Bronze Ages, there are thought to have been groups of people occupying the land, from hunter-gatherers to domestic farmers. And what we do know about them mostly comes from the artefacts they left behind, from farming tools to pottery, but still we don't know for sure what all actually happened in this time. There are many speculations as to where each group came from, what killed them off, if they did in fact die off, or if they assimilated into one another. The Celts arrived in Ireland during the Iron Age or in 500 BC. Again, lack of facts on this time means we don't fully know how it went, but wide speculation is that the people there adopted the Celts' introduction of Iron Age technologies, and that there was no real break between the Stone, Bronze and Iron Ages. The Celts originated in Europe. They were forced to move from there due to attacks from the Romans, and they migrated all over Europe, but many settled in what is known as Ireland and Great Britain. The Celts who made it there had better chance of survival being on an island away from the mainland, and that's why we see a lot more Celtic history in this area. The group that settled in Ireland and Scotland are known as the Gaels. They practiced pagan culture until the introduction of Christianity around 600 BC. Believed to have been introduced due to interactions with the Romans. From my research, I believe that Celtic Christianity is somewhat a blend of paganism and Christianity. It seems to be a result of the missionaries coming to introduce Christianity, that they molded the Christian beliefs to entice the Irish into accepting. So a lot of that pagan mythology carried through in the culture and continues there today, or at least the history of it is there today. Ireland encountered many invasions throughout history. To start, the Vikings, they came from Scandinavia, tried to invade, but their efforts weren't too detrimental. The Vikings actually assimilated and they built cities like Dublin. The 1100s is when England began their invasions and things really started to go wrong. The Normans, who ruled the Kingdom of England at the time, were actually invited over by some of the kings and lords of Ireland to be alliances in their own battles. The Normans, they moved into areas of Ireland and they actually mixed with Irish. They married Irish women and they assimilated in. So pretty much peaceful sharing of the land, the Irish clans still free to live as they had been. Over the next 400 to 500 years though, their relationship was no longer peaceful due to a new rule in England that brought about changes. The English wanted to civilize the wild and barbaric Irish as they thought their ways were very backward. They didn't like that they hadn't progressed to arable farming. Rather, they continued to live by cattle rearing. They would follow their herds in a nomadic and unsettled lifestyle. This, the English believed to be a sign of primitive nature and a sign that they were not progressing as they should. So over the course of history, the Celts proved to be extremely disobedient to the English's continued attempts to show them the right way. The English began to confiscate land. They called them plantations, and they would send their British people over to run them and try to show the Irish how they should be living. Over time, some Irish leaders became worried about their own power, and they promised loyalty to the King of England based on promises that were made to them. Inevitably, this caused conflict between the clans, between those who did and those who did not join with the English. And again, then with the clans who did go with the English, they began to rebel due to the promises not being kept. So I started to see similarities here in how the English have colonized other nations. The promise making, the taking land without any real legal right, the gradual infiltration, all sounds very similar. Over the water in Britain at the same time, lies were being made up as propaganda to cause further divide with the people. They would tell the people in England that Irish were cannibals, that they were lazy, stupid, and inferior race. The word Celt is actually derived from a word, I think it's pronounced Keltoi, a name given by the ancient Greeks meaning barbaric. Okay, so basically, over the many years, there were many rebellions by the Irish, but they were continually defeated. In 1604, after the 9-Year War, all Irish chiefs swore loyalty to the crown in a treaty that was basically an ultimatum. Either we force this upon you and take your land and rights, or you agree and you get the illusion that the land is still yours. 1801, Ireland officially became part of the Union of Great Britain, and the Irish Parliament was abolished at this time. Again, Irish felt they had no choice but to accept the Union rather than accept even worse consequences. One major thing I want to mention now is that England had a majority Protestant religion known as the Anglican faith, and Ireland had a majority Catholic. The rule of Ireland under the power of Britain had detrimental effects on the people of Ireland. Catholics were looked upon as second-class citizens. They were not allowed to carry out their religion anymore. No more mass. They were not allowed to vote, and they were not allowed to be a member of Parliament. So even though they were still their own country under the Union, they were not allowed to be in any parliament that ran that country. Something that I want to touch on that was brought up in class once about how in Canada here, First Nations people can be told apart by their last names, and before they're even met, they can see it on paper, and how this can go against them in certain circumstances. So the same thing in Ireland, names could be told apart, and this would go against them in situations such as for a job or in court. And I would say still today, this probably still happens in certain institutions. The next thing I want to talk about is the potato famine in 1845. This was when potato crops failed due to a disease known as blight. Something though that is not as commonly known is that other crops were grown in Ireland at this time, such as grain and corn, but these were all transported out of Ireland. This was a contract put in place by the Crown, and even as thousands starved to death, the English would not waive this forced exportation. It is estimated that 1 million people died from the famine over the course of 5 years, and another 1 million emigrated away, because if they could leave, they would leave. Sorry, I've lost my place. Okay, the English government seen it as a way of reducing the populations. The head of administration for famine relief, I have actually found a quote from him. The judgment of God sent this calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. So linking this to course material that we've seen, we heard very similar stories in class of how famine killed millions here in Canada, as if it was some kind of natural disaster that no one could have helped. But what isn't as well known is the English were in control of the food that could have been had. They made it look like they were helping in some small way. Like in Ireland, they would have soup kitchens and such, but there were so many in need that that barely helped, and it was really just for show. Next thing I want to talk about is the Easter Rising of 1916. So a group of Irish nationalists staged an uprising in the city of Dublin. They were defeated, and the 15 leaders of the rebellion were all executed to death, and around 1,800 who were believed to have supported the rebellion were arrested and sent to jails in England without trial. The result of this defeat only caused more anger and fueled public resentment towards the British. In 1921, independence was finally declared, this time after a widespread guerrilla war campaign that was fought over 5 years. Finally, we'd think it was over, but no. 6 of the northern counties that were not made fully independent at this time, they are still known today as Northern Ireland, and this is still part of the United Kingdom. This is down to, again, the religious differences between the Irish Catholics and the Protestants. This area being predominantly Protestant, they wanted at the time to remain. But this, we know, still does not work. You may have heard of like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is something pretty recent. This started 1970s and lasted 3 decades. The guerrilla war that I mentioned before that won the independence for the Republic basically didn't end there, and there emerged multiple armed paramilitary organizations for both sides. One side wanting independence and one side wanting to remain. The conflicts between these groups led to bombings and riots in the streets. British troops were then sent over. At first, the civilians were relieved, as this was really not anything to do with their choice. but it turned out that the army were pretty one-sided. An event sometimes known as Bloody Sunday, where a group of unarmed civilian protesters were shot dead by British soldiers in the street. And this was only in 1972. I'm not saying that I condone the actions of any of the paramilitary groups. I won't say that the Catholic groups are angels in any way. What I'm trying to stress here is the length of the conflict between the nations and the methods that the Irish felt they had to go to be free of our English rule. Like, what if the English had minded their own business all those many, many, many years ago? So as I mentioned before, I'm from Scotland, and I want to share just a little inside knowledge. I didn't learn any of this in history in the school system, but what I did grow up knowing is that I grew up knowing that I shouldn't like the English, and I grew up knowing that Protestants didn't like Catholics and vice versa. I didn't know why, and I don't think a lot of people there did either. I think it's really a lot less about religion and more the consequence of the events in history that have led to generation after generation being told stories that maybe have lost meaning, but they still have so much power. And I want to now conclude my project. I just want to talk a bit about the future and tie it into our teachings from the course. So our recent readings from the Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan book have started to talk about reconciliation and moving forward. The main point I've taken from it is that education is key. The elders talk about how learning about the past and the real history is so important, and I think this is very relevant across the globe. Our education systems are clearly lacking, and I think we have to take it upon ourselves to educate. I often thought that I didn't know anything about politics, so I have no right to talk about it. But now I realise that politics are everyone's business, and it really is just everything that happens to us every day. This course and project have definitely motivated me to want to continue learning and involve myself more. I'm hopeful for a future with more variety in government, to see an addition of individuals who have an actual understanding of real life and oppression. And I think our biggest problem is class differences and the power being in the wrong hands. I want to finish on a quick quote from anthropologist Margaret Mead. So, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Let's keep fighting.